You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 26th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme, Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal stands trial in Russia, facing up to 20 years in prison, essentially for being a good reporter. We'll have the latest after that.
Dear Ukrainians, today has been a very eventful day. We have officially started negotiations on membership with the European Union. This is a historic result. We have been working on it for a long time.
President Zelensky celebrates the start of EU accession talks and arrest warrants issued for top Russian officials by the ICC. But he also has to fire a top general. We'll get an update on the war effort. Then to Germany, where a new citizenship law comes into effect tomorrow that, among other things, requires recognition of Israel's right to exist. After that,
I believe in standing up for Australian citizens, and I make that very clear. I made it clear from the beginning. I had the same position as opposition leader on all of these issues as I've had as Prime Minister. And as Prime Minister of Australia, you have an opportunity to make a difference.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese there on the arrival of Julian Assange in Canberra. And finally, we'll count down to just 1 month until the Paris Olympics. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich appeared behind closed doors today in a Russian court, facing spying allegations that the Journal and the US government have once again sternly rejected. Gershkovich was arrested for essentially doing his job, being an investigative reporter in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But he now finds himself facing up to 20 years in prison in a country that underlined its aggressive approach this week by banning 80 further Western media outlets from operating in the country. U.S. diplomatic efforts to negotiate a prisoner exchange are ongoing. Well, Grania McCarthy is International Chief Digital Editor at The Wall Street Journal and joins us now. Grania, great to have you on the show. This trial was behind closed doors, or is being held behind closed doors, but what do we know about what has happened today in court?
Well, the first thing is we got to see Evan. Evan was present in court. There were some cameras allowed into the courtroom at the beginning of the proceedings. This is a courtroom in Yekaterinburg where Evan was arrested nearly 15 months ago to the day. And so we got to see Evan. His head was shaven. He's definitely had a haircut. But he looked good. He smiled. He sort of waved at one point. And then the reporters were shuffled out of the room. And so the rest of it was conducted in closed door circumstances. And I should just like to reiterate what you've been saying at the outset here and call this a sham trial. This is not a normal legal proceedings. It's being carried out in secret and with little to no transparency. And Evan is being afforded none of the due process that he would experience in a Western legal system.
Tell us a little bit more about that, if you're able to. What kind of assistance is Evan able to get, either legally or, for that matter, from the US government when it comes to his trial?
Well, Evan, as I say, has been in prison now for coming up on 15 months, and we have lawyers in Russia who get to see him and have been getting in to see him about once a week. So these are two very brave lawyers. But given the nature of the case, this is an espionage case. There's very limited visibility into, these trumped up charges that Russia has come up with, or trumped up accusations, I should say. And we are, to be clear, in our coverage, calling them false accusations against Evan. Evan is a brilliant, gifted journalist steeped in Russia and in the Russian culture, and had been covering Russia for us, and prior to that for some other news organizations. He knows only too well how this has been going in Vladimir Putin's Russia with the crackdown on the free press. And he actually has covered previous cases, most notably that of Brittany Griner, the NBA basketball star who had been in prison in Russia. and was ultimately swapped for a notorious arms dealer, Victor Bout, as part of a high-level US-Russia hostage swap.
And what was it like, if I can ask, for you and for the Journal, for that matter, just to even see those pictures of Evan today? Presumably, you haven't been able to see much of him at all during this incarceration. What was that like? What kind of sense did you get about how he's doing?
Yeah, we not only saw the pictures, but we saw video footage of him in the courtroom. And this has been something that we have seen periodically over the course of these 15 months as we have appealed every step of this of the way in this baseless case. I always describe it as both heartening and heartbreaking. It's awful to see Evan in those circumstances. Today it was even more striking because he was in this sort of glass cage that Russia uses in its court system, but the door was padlocked shut. And so it's hard, but it's also, we draw inspiration from him because he is an inspirational person, and he is holding up and he is strong. He works hard at staying strong physically. He's been in Lefortovo prison in Moscow for the most of his time, and now he's in Yekaterinburg, but which is about 900 miles away. But he worked hard at sort of trying to stay physically strong, despite the fact that, during that time in Moscow, he was largely confined to a cell for 23 of 24 hours a day. So when we see him, it just emboldens us even further to do whatever we can to make as much noise as we can. We've enjoyed a lot of support from across the US and the world in support of our efforts to free Evan. And so we will just keep going.
Well, and then speaking of the sort of joint efforts, what kind of coordination you've had, I wonder if you could talk a little about whether there's been any coordination with the US government or just what the US government has been doing on this. There have been some kind of efforts to secure his release, both you obviously, the Journal, calling for his release, but also this idea of a possible prisoner exchange. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
I mean, I'm not privy to those discussions. They happen at a government-to-government level, but we are certainly, sure that the U.S. government has been very active on this front. Vladimir Putin himself has on several occasions talked about Evan and the possibility of some sort of a deal with the United States. So our only hope really is that this sham trial would raise the pressure even further on the US administration to do everything it can to get Evan home. This is a sort of a black and white situation. Evan is either free or he's not free. And that's the only priority we have, and that's the only thing that keeps us going. So, we hope that the pressure is as high as it's ever been, and that Evan gets to come home as soon as possible.
And just finally, Grania, I wonder how Evan's loved ones are coping. Is that something you're able to speak to as well? Has the Journal been in touch with them throughout this process?
Absolutely. His family are incredibly brave and wonderful individuals. Evan was born in New Jersey, and he and his sister Danielle were raised there by their parents, who were Soviet Jewish emigres to the United States in the 1970s. And his father described it, I thought, very poignantly in an interview that he did with the Wall Street Journal. He and his wife did with the Wall Street Journal around the 1-year anniversary of Evan's imprisonment, where he said it feels, being on this road with us feels a little bit like the burden is shared. So the Wall Street Journal stands absolutely shoulder to shoulder with Evan's family. And, we're kind of part of a club that we never wanted to be part of, but we're very much on this road with them.
Thank you very much for joining us, Grania. That was Grania McCarthy, International Chief Digital Editor of the Wall Street Journal. Now here's George Ruskin with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. The NATO military alliance has formally selected Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte to be its next Secretary-General. In a statement, the Western Alliance said Rutte would take up the post on the 1st of October, succeeding Jens Stoltenberg, who has held the job for the past decade. Rutte will leave his post in the Netherlands as soon as a new government is inaugurated there. North Korea has test-fired a hypersonic missile that exploded in mid-air, according to South Korea and Japan's militaries. The missile flew more than 200 kilometers and comes amid heightened tensions on the Korean peninsula. South Korea, Japan and the United States condemned the launch as a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. And India has elected a Speaker of the lower house of Parliament in the first test of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's new coalition government. Om Birla from Modi's own Bharatiya Janata Party was reselected by a voice vote. Modi's BJP lost its majority in elections held earlier this month, but is governing with other parties in his Democratic Alliance. Those are the headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, George. It's been a mixed blessing of a week so far for Ukraine. The country is marking the formal start of EU accession talks and is also no doubt welcoming the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants for Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov. Still, the war goes on, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was forced this week to fire one of his top generals from their post for essentially causing too many Ukrainian casualties. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Olga Tokariuk, a Ukrainian journalist and fellow at Chatham House Leadership Academy based in London. Olga, always great to have you on the show. Let's start with these EU accession talks that began yesterday. How big a moment was this for Ukraine? How was it marked in Ukraine?
Hi, Chris. Well, it was a huge moment. It was a moment that several generations of Ukrainians were expecting, were fighting for years. Two revolutions, that happened in Ukraine, popular uprisings when people were going to the streets to demand closer ties with Europe. And of course, in light of those huge losses that Ukraine is suffering as a result of Russian aggression, one of the goals of which was actually to stop Ukraine getting closer to the West, to the club of Western democracies, which is the European Union. So, of course, it's a huge achievement, a strong political signal that Ukraine is now firmly a part of the West, that Ukraine will become a member of the European Union. We don't know how long it will take. The formal start of negotiations, of accession negotiations, was announced yesterday, but the first chapters of negotiations will likely be opened only early next year after Hungary leaves the post of the country who has the EU rotating presidency, and Poland will be at the helm of the EU. So yes, it will take years. It will not be fast, but this is definitely a historic moment.
Well, and one thing else I wanted to ask you about, Olga, these International Criminal Court arrest warrants issued today, that also makes this sort of a busy day of symbolism, I suppose. We have the EU accession and then at the same time this move against Russia's defense minister and chief of general staff. How is that being recognized, I suppose, in Ukraine? Symbolic, or is it something more in a hope that there might be justice at the end of this?
Well, definitely it gives that hope. They are already the fifth and the sixth highest ranking Russian official who have been indicted by the International Criminal Court, and the arrest warrant was issued for them. They are accused of direct actions and ordering actions of the Russian military that caused huge damage to Ukrainian civilian population by attacking Ukrainian energy infrastructure, by attacking Ukrainian civilian objects. So I think these arrest warrants are also seen as a sign that, yes, for now they won't be arrested, but they will know that these arrest warrants are there. They will not be able to move freely. They will not be able to go to dozens of countries of the world that recognize the jurisdiction of International Criminal Court. And eventually, that kind of also gives hope to the survivors of Russian aggression and relatives of the victims of Russian aggression in Ukraine that justice will be served one day.
You did mention that part of the reason for these arrest warrants was Russia's attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. I wonder if you could give us a bit of an update on that as well. This is something that has been continuing, obviously. How is Ukraine's energy infrastructure holding up at the moment?
Well, half of Ukrainian energy facilities, that's the minimum estimate, are destroyed as a result of these Russian attacks. Currently, there are vast blackouts across all of Ukraine, including western regions, which are relatively safer. So in some parts of Ukraine, there are only 5 hours of electricity per day. And, because it is summer and the daylight, there is plenty of daylight, people are kind of coping with that. But there are stark warnings from the Ukrainian officials that Ukrainians have to prepare to a very harsh winter, when maybe there will be maximum of 8 hours of electricity per day. So people are stocking up on generators. They are stocking up on heaters, which, like wood burners and things that would allow them to stay warm in winter if there is no electricity supply. There have been some repair works going on, and the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference in Berlin earlier this month, Ukraine was promised additional funding for the restoration of its energy infrastructure, but it will take time. And most likely, the majority of the infrastructure that has been destroyed won't be repaired before winter.
And just one other thing we did want to talk about, Olga, this the firing of General Yuri Sodol in Ukraine by Zelensky earlier this week. What can you tell us about that, why he was let go, and how that might change how Ukraine is operating in this war?
Yeah, so the Lieutenant General Yuri Sodol was appointed in February this year. And he was very harshly criticized by the Ukrainian servicemen, by commanders of various Ukrainian brigades for his neglect towards human life and Ukrainian losses. So he's been accused of basically just not caring about how many soldiers' lives it will take to, achieve that or another goal. He didn't have any victories to boast. Actually, he's responsible for the loss of the city of Volnovakha in the Donetsk region. So there has been a lot of criticism. And actually, there was a big post on social media on the day when Zelensky announced the decision to fire him just a couple of hours before. I think, does it tell us? It tells us that the Ukrainian government and President Zelensky are still very, they really care about public opinion. They really care about the reputation of the military forces. And, when there is criticism, they are ready to react. So the replacement who was appointed instead of him, Andriy Ignatov, is considered as a very efficient, highly professional brigade general. He was introduced just today by President Zelensky to Ukrainian servicemen in the Donetsk region. And actually the president, while speaking there to Ukrainian soldiers, he stressed that it is important for Ukraine to care about its soldiers, to preserve as many soldiers' lives as possible.
Olga Tokariuk, thank you as always for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. For decades, anyone applying for German citizenship has had to give up their original citizenship as part of the process. Immigrants who came to Germany as children also had to choose which citizenship to keep when they turned 18. Both of those requirements will now end as part of a new citizenship law that takes effect this week. Also noteworthy is a new requirement that citizens declare the right of the State of Israel to exist. Well, joining us now is James Jackson, a freelance journalist based in Berlin. James, this is quite a relaxation of laws for Germany when it comes to citizenship, isn't it? How is that being treated there?
Absolutely. I think this is a landmark change in how Germany and Germans will be perceived and how their country will function, because it has had for quite a since the 90s and 2000s, still quite a strict law, but actually it used to be even stricter. So I think we're seeing a fundamental change in who can be German and a relaxing particularly of laws for non-Europeans. So under EU law, up until now, European citizens, EU citizens, have been able to have dual citizenship, but non-Europeans haven't. So that's Brits, but also there's a large number of Turks in Germany who will now be able to apply for citizenship, as well as some of the Arab and Middle Eastern citizens who came in 2015 in the aftermath.
How much of a sense do we get of how many people are actually likely to take advantage of this new law when you speak either of those from the Middle East or from Turkey, for that matter? I wonder if there are a fair amount of Turks who say would have taken up German citizenship but were not prepared to give up their Turkish citizenship to do it.
There absolutely are quite a lot of Turks who, feel very proudly Turkish and have experienced some forms of discrimination and so have decided to keep their Turkish identity. Turkey has quite a strong nationalist tradition as well. I think the question of how much are we going to see? Well, we've already seen double the amount of citizenship applications since it's passed in Berlin. And so, unfortunately, the German authorities are extremely stretched. They do not have so many resources for these new citizenship centres. So if you are applying for citizenship in Berlin, like many of my contacts are, you might be seeing a wait of up to 2 years.
The bureaucracy can take a while, especially with so many applications. But what also can you tell us, James, about this requirement that's interesting as well regarding Israel and recognizing the right of Israel to exist? What is that about? Why now?
So I'm not actually... I think this report is a little bit unclear, if I'm honest with you, because the way that the Financial Times have titled it makes it sound like there will be a new question that everyone has to sign up to. But from what I've seen, and I have spoken to the Interior Ministry a few times today, it looks like there will just be a question about Israel and whether you're allowed to call for its destruction, which you're not, in the questions for the test, rather than a recognition of the right to exist. But that it is possible that it will be part of the basic recognition of the free democratic order. But I think the press releases from the Interior Ministry have been a bit unclear, and it's entirely possible that this won't be the case, although I have to say it already is the case in the eastern state of Saxony-Anhalt, where they are also pushing for this to be they're pushing for this law to be rolled out nationwide. But I haven't seen anything about it in the German press, nor have they stated it explicitly. So we're all reading the lines between some rather unclear press releases. But of course, Israel, for Germany, Israel's existence is a non-negotiable for Germany. We've seen that Germany joined the genocide case brought by South Africa by the International Court on Israel's side. We've also seen many cases of pro-Palestine protests being quite heavily policed, people being arrested or even threatened with deportation for social media posts, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, being an extremely contentious phrase worldwide, but especially in Germany, where it can, if you post that online, you could see your house being raided by a SWAT team at 6 a.m, as has happened a number of times in Berlin.
And just finally, James, when it comes to this citizenship law, I do wonder if there has been any opposition at all, either to the relaxation that we were talking about, or just this general talk of sort of citizens having to share German values, whether it is that question about Israel or other questions as well.
There definitely has been opposition, particularly from the main opposition party, the CDU, the Christian Democrats, party of Angela Merkel, now led by rather more right-wing figure Friedrich Merz. And they've opposed what they call a cheapening of German citizenship. So there has been Germany is in a rather long process of conversation about what it means to be German, who is German. And I think the Olaf Scholz's traffic light government came down quite strongly on one side, initially saying that this is a country of migration. But since then, the mood has shifted somewhat to the right. And there are many people, we've seen the AfD, far-right party, rising through the polls. Migration has come really to the top of the political agenda, also amid the terrorist attack in Mannheim. So the conversation's not finished. There are definitely people who oppose new citizenship, but then there are many, many who are happy about it, because Germany is actually a country with quite a lot of migrants, and almost, I think, 25% of citizens have some kind of migration history in their family.
Germany still trying to figure out its identity. James Jackson, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is the briefing on Monocle Radio. It's time now for an update on Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, who was declared a free man in a Pacific Island courtroom earlier today after pleading guilty to US conspiracy charges and being sentenced to time already served. He then flew on to his home country of Australia, arriving just a few hours ago. His touchdown in Canberra will finally bring an end to a saga that has dragged on for more than a decade, caused an untold number of diplomatic incidents and polarised, well, pretty much everybody around the world. Joining us now is Tessa Ursula, a freelance correspondent based in Sydney. Tessa, good to have you on the show. Tell us about the scene at the airport, first of all. What was it like?
Yeah, hi there, Chris. Well, as can be expected, the atmosphere at the military base in Canberra, where Julian Assange's plane landed, was really quite celebratory. A lot of his supporters were there. You can hear cheering in the background. It was also quite emotional. So the first time we see Julian stepping out of the plane, he looks up at the sky and raised a triumphant fist, and a lot of cheering. And of course, his family were there. His wife and his father that he hadn't seen in 14 years, and that is, and his legal team as well. So those the supporters, and now we're hearing from his lawyer Jennifer Robinson, who's actually at a live press conference at the moment. Now, shortly after that, we heard from Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. He said that he had spoken to Julian Assange, and Albanese expressed the relief and that he's pleased with the outcome, that Julian Assange is finally back home. Now, what's interesting to note, Chris, is that he had repeated what he kept saying throughout the day in Parliament, and saying that whatever your views on Julian Assange, there was nothing to be gained by his continued incarceration. Now, he does this because this is a view that crosses party lines. We've heard this expressed by politicians across the board here, saying that we set aside what we think of what Julian Assange did, whether or not we agree with his actions. Opposition finance spokeswoman Jane Hume has said that Assange was no hero of hers, but she does welcome his return. So this is a repeated sentiment across political lines. But as you said earlier, that what Julian Assange did has been divisive. So that is a conversation here on, amongst people who say, yeah, we're glad he's back in the country, but there is a conversation of, does this set a dangerous precedent for journalism and whistleblowing, or did what he do, was that reckless and dangerous an action? And that's a conversation we've been having for the last 14 years. I would also, like to bring up that dangerous precedent line has been raised by politicians and his lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, because they're asking for people to continue to support him in terms of a presidential pardon, asking Joe Biden potentially for a presidential pardon. Now, the prime minister has not said anything or weighed on any debate relating to the actions of Julian Assange, but I can say that I think it's unambiguous that Australians, in general, politicians and also people are, relieved to see him back here, in the sense that they feel that it just wasn't serving any purpose anymore for his continued incarceration. I think that there's broad agreement when it comes to that.
So there's agreement on that, but just as one final question for you, Tess, as well, what does that mean going forward, I suppose? Even whatever the feelings were about his incarceration, what is the expectation there about whether he might, play some kind of role in Australian society going forward?
Oh, I think there's been, of course, a lot of speculation on what he's going to do after, of course, he has recovered from his experiences. Now, I think his continued role in what journalism means, what whistleblowing means, and there's been a lot of opinion expressed on him continuing to be vocal on that. Let's not forget that in Australia, very recently, in fact, there's also been a case of a military whistleblower who had been sentenced to jail. So that is, there are parallels to that will most definitely be brought to the surface on where the country stands when it comes to defining what journalism is, what the rights of journalists are, what freedom of speech means, because there are parallels, and this will be a conversation, I think, that will be drawn out. It is a strong conversation in this country on what journalism is. Can we even call someone like Julian Assange a journalist, and where you draw the line, and big governments and powerful governments. So I think Julian Assange is not the last time we see him. This is probably just the beginning of, a more continued conversation around what he had fought for and stood for.
Tessa Ursula, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. This is The Briefing, and finally on today's show, with just 1 month to go until the Olympics in Paris, not to mention Monocle opening its own pop-up office in Paris tomorrow, it is time to get an update on the preparations. I'm joined by Monocle's Claudia Jacob. Claudia, how ready is Paris for this 1 month out?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting time for the city. We're coming off the back of Paris Fashion Week, the city's last sort of big undertaking before the Olympic Games in just over a month's time. And now that we've sort of passed that, it really does feel like we're on the home stretch. The Olympic rings are adorning the Eiffel Tower, and the torch is arriving in Strasbourg today. And within the next month, it'll be winding its way through the rest of the country until it reaches the opening ceremony on the 26th of July. There's definitely a sense that a historic event is upon us exactly a century after Paris last hosted the Olympics, even if certain conditions and requirements of the Games do remain a bit uncertain.
Well, we'll get to some of those uncertainties in a moment, but I just wonder if you could talk a bit more about sort of how much these games are impacting the city. I mean, these games are going to be very much directly in the city rather than the suburbs. How much is Paris changing?
Yeah, that's definitely true. The city is certainly sensing something of a shift at the moment. It's getting harder to move around the city. Central metro stations like Concorde are now completely inaccessible. This site is going to host sort of an urban park for the skateboarding and BMX biking. And Paris is actually starting to empty out at the moment as both tourists and international business travel effectively starts to wind down for a brief hiatus period. I saw a reduction of 15% in flights coming into Paris compared to this time last year. So there's definitely a sort of pause before, it's the calm before the storm, effectively.
That is absolutely a sort of calm before the storm. What about Parisians themselves? Are they also exiting at this point, or are they sort of battening down the hatches before it all starts?
Definitely exiting. I think almost half of Parisians will be leaving the city. Whether or not they'll be able to sort of enjoy Paris for what it really is sort of uncertain. I mean, there's been talk about how security zones are going to be in operation around the river, which is effectively going to cut the city in two for a short period of time. And that's in operation from the 18th of July. So for people who aren't spectators or games officials, it's going to be very difficult to actually move around the city and to visit certain museums. Cafes and restaurants in those zones are largely remaining closed because it doesn't really seem like it's worth it for them. Whether or not they'll be compensated for that remains unclear, but it's certainly not going to be a typical summer in the French capital.
And what can you tell us about some of the uncertainties that are still remaining 1 month out, particularly perhaps about where the opening ceremony might be held? How has that been going?
Yeah, so the second rehearsal for the opening ceremony, which is supposed to take place on the Seine, there's supposed to be a procession of 90 barges with over 10,000 athletes. It was scheduled for Monday, but had to be delayed because of elevated water levels, which appeared to be 5 times higher than this period last year. It's a shame if the opening ceremony won't be able to take place on the Seine, because sort of the whole point of it was that it was going to be the first opening ceremony outside of a stadium, which is going to really democratize the opening ceremony. A lot of the tickets were actually free for people to go and watch. And so it was really going to give people an opportunity to get involved, even if they weren't directly buying tickets. And so that will be a shame. And possibly even more worrying is that the Seine still doesn't appear to be clean enough to be able to host the triathlon and para-triathlon at the moment. And it does really seem incredibly unlikely at this point that that is going to be possible at all. And, the Seine was such a large part of not only the sort of the Games itself, but also of Mayor Anne Hidalgo's manifesto, which she's been running for years about cleaning up the city, wider initiatives about pedestrianising the Champs-Élysées. So if the Seine isn't able to play the part that it was supposed to play during the Games, then it will be a shame both for the Games itself and for the legacy that it leaves for Paris.
And just finally, Claudia, before we let you go, as you mentioned Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo there, she has said that she has difficulty understanding why President Emmanuel Macron called for French elections so close to the Olympics. I just wonder if you could comment on that. How is the fact that the elections are being held right around this time as well being treated by Parisians?
Yeah, it seems, a strange time. I think the organising committee of the Olympics is sort of trying to downplay the effect of this and what effects it might have around the Games. They sort of are saying that actually decisions, surrounding the games have been, in the works for a while. So I think, it's people are having difficulty understanding why it's happened so close to the event. And, there are already significant security worries surrounding terrorism and cyber attacks. And I don't think that the elections are going to potentially pose more chaos, but let's hope that they're able to keep it under control.
Let's certainly hope so, and that some excitement can build once the elections are over in Paris. That was Claudia Jacob. Thank you very much for joining us. Just to let you know, Monocle Radio will be heading to Paris between the 28th of July and the 11th of August, bringing you coverage from the centre of the action with our team on the ground, correspondents and expert contributors joining us in our pop-up studios located at Maison Alliance at the Sohotel in Paris. That is all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAvinney. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and George Ruskin. Our studio manager was Flynn Simons with editing assistance from Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.